Three. Okay, here we go. I'm going to start this class by talking about the history of evolutionary thought, and I tend to focus on Charles Darwin's life because it was an interesting life in many ways and a pivotal life in more ways than one. So, starts with Dr. Robert Darwin. He was a medical doctor in a town in the west of England, close to the border with Wales, called Shrewsbury. Very financially well off. He wasn't a noble, but his medical practice brought in some good revenue. He married a wife from a very wealthy family. Um, this is the time at the beginning of the 1800s. If you remember your world history, you might know that this time frame is when the Industrial Revolution is just beginning to kick off, and we're starting to see, increases in things like coal mining, the development of steam engines. We're still not quite at the big growth of the railroads as yet, but this is a time of, building of factories and increased manufacturing and trade and things like that. Robert Darwin invested his money in a lot of industrial enterprises, and he didn't often lose. And so his family grew up quite well off, including his fifth child, his second son, Charles Robert Darwin, born in 1809, February 12th, 1809, the same day and year as Abraham Lincoln, although that's just one of those weird coincidences, I guess. So here he is at the age of 7. The year before his mother died, he was mostly brought up by his sisters. And I'll kind of fast forward through his childhood. It was mostly pretty uneventful. Hated school, loved going off and rambling in the woods, interested in science from an early age. He and his brother actually had a chemistry set and did a lot of chemistry experiments. And for a while, Charles Darwin's nickname was Gas, apparently because a lot of their chemistry experiments ended up not smelling very good. And I'll fast forward to 1824. Charles Darwin has finished the equivalent of high school, and his father has sent him off to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland to study medicine. One of the big things that's changed between this time and now is the nature of university education. There weren't majors as we think of them now. You couldn't spend 4 years studying, anthropology, sociology, underwater basket weaving, what have you. You went to university to study law or medicine or theology, preparing for the ministry. Edinburgh was known as a center for medical education. Scotland had its own church, so theology degrees weren't really useful outside of Scotland. Scottish law wasn't useful outside of Scotland, but medicine you can take anywhere. And so Edinburgh had a great reputation as a medical school. It was where Dr. Robert Darwin had gone, and it was where Dr. Robert Darwin sent his sons, Charles and Erasmus. Darwin was a medical student for 2 years. After the first year, pretty much decided he didn't want to go on, but he stuck it out for a second year just to keep his father happy. Unfortunately, many of his professors were colossal bores, and it also turned out he couldn't stand the sight of blood. That might sound a little weak on his part, but bear in mind that we're still a few years out from the discovery of anesthesia. This is coming, anesthesia comes in the 1830s, I think, is when people discover chloroform and ether. Um, but this is still the time when the surgeon's assistants are really heavy people whose job it is to hold the patient down as the surgeon cuts with no anesthesia and also no cleanliness, because the germ theory of disease hasn't come around with. And doctors used to go from the morgue doing autopsies right into the operating room without even washing their hands. One of you, I forget who, but one of you was going to be wants to get into medical school. Be very glad it wasn't in 1824. So, for example, he went to the lectures of a man named Alexander Monroe. Monroe was actually the son and the grandson of famous anatomy professors. In fact, the foramen of Monroe is something that his grandfather discovered. It's one of the connecting passages between ventricles and the brain. So this guy's grandfather was famous. This guy himself used to read his grandfather's old lecture notes in class, as if nobody had discovered anything for the past 50 years. And surgeons at the time used to take this kind of perverse pride in never washing their coats. So they'd operate in these black coats that would get absolutely caked with dried blood and dried who knows what else. And so Darwin wrote home and said, I dislike him and his lectures so much that I cannot speak with decency about them. He is so dirty in person and actions. Medicine was a dirty business at the time. That's Darwin's admissions ticket to his classes. Time was you had to show a ticket to get into a lecture. And he reminisced as an older man that he would hate the name of materia medica. That's what they used to call pharmacology. And remember that in this day and age, medicines were primarily derived from plants. So this is where you learn not just about drugs, but about the plants that provide them. Darwin hated it ever since hearing, what was his first name? Not important. Dr. Duncan's lectures at 8 o'clock on a winter's morning. And in Edinburgh, 8 o'clock is still dark. In the wintertime, you get maybe 6 or 7 hours of sun. A whole cold breakfastless hour on the properties of rhubarb. So if you think some of your classes here are bad, it could be a lot worse. You could have an 8 o'clock class with no breakfast in a cold and dark city on the properties of rhubarb. Yeah, could be a lot worse. I guess if I ever have to threaten you folks, I'm just going to break out the rhubarb. Right. But as often happens, the best learning was done outside the classroom. And Darwin had this great knack for finding mentors. And he made the acquaintance of a physician named Dr. Robert Grant, who was no longer practicing medicine and was captivated by invertebrate zoology. Darwin and Dr. Grant used to go down to the docks. Edinburgh is a port town. And look at interesting things that the fishermen brought in. There was a little student biology society. It was called the Plinian Society. Darwin wrote a couple of papers that were published there. His little, undergraduate research projects. And he learned something else. Grant wasn't just a retired doctor who was interested in critters with no backbones. He'd had some radical ideas inspired by the work of a French scientist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was still alive in Paris at this time. Lamarck had been trained as a botanist. When the French Revolution hit, the King of France's personal collection of cool stuff was seized and turned into the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. The king had no further use for them after they chopped off his head. And it used to be quite the fashion for royals to have collections of, well, not just art, but, skeletons and fossils and, you know, taxidermied animals and things like that, just rare and curious curiosities. And when that was taken over, Lamarck was named professor of insects and worms. He was the professor of invertebrates, but Lamarck actually coined the word invertebrates, probably because he was sick of telling people he was the professor of insects and worms. Anyway, Lamarck had this mind that was just really big on the big idea. And he didn't sit very well in his own discipline. He came up with his own theories of chemistry, for example, which turned out to be wrong. He tried his hand at coming up with rigorous ways to predict the weather. That ended up not working. And in biology, he went for this really big theory, and it's the first theory of evolution. The idea that evolution happens is just the idea that the life on Earth changes over time, and that goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. You can trace that, more than 2,000 years back. There were Romans writing about the possibility. Lamarck was not the first to come up with the idea of evolution, but he proposed a theory of what made it happen, why living things should change their shapes over many, many generations, going back many, many thousands, maybe millions of years. So he came up with a theory of evolution. And as he wrote, the structure of the individuals and of their parts, their organs, their faculties, etc., are entirely the result of the circumstances to which the race of each species has found itself subjected by nature. Organisms have the structure the way they do, they look the way they do, they have the anatomy that they have because the environment that they live in shapes them, causes them to change. Organisms were not made to fit in an environment. The environment made them to fit. So, again, Lamarck was the first to propose a theory of why evolution would happen. He was not the first to think that new life forms could be produced from old ones, but working out a theory of the process that did this. And it goes like this. Organisms live in environments, and environment shapes the behaviors that they have. If an environment changes, the organism has to change its behavior. So imagine you're a bird, a little ground feeding bird, like, I don't know, a robin or something, hopping around, picking up seeds or, pulling worms out of the ground or whatever it is. So you're a little hop, 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 hop bird. Let's say the environment changes and suddenly the climate becomes a lot wetter. Well, getting your feathers wet is not a good idea. So a bird in this new environment is going to have to change its behavior. Specifically, it's going to have a lot more puddles to navigate. So like you, when there's lots of puddles on the sidewalk, it's going to have to start stretching its legs and taking bigger steps. Okay, let's say the environment keeps changing that way. The puddles are going to get bigger and bigger. The bird is going to have to stretch its legs out more and more. That change in behavior is going to cause a change in form. The bird's legs will grow longer than they would if the environment had not changed, because of all of the constant muscular work of stretching out those legs. Much as if I put you in environments where all of a sudden you had to carry very heavy loads all the time, your muscles would grow bigger and your bones would grow thicker to adapt your body to the loads that you would be carrying, right? So your body can change over the course of its lifetime to fit new circumstances. If I put everybody in an environment where there was more sunlight, most of us would tan to some degree. We can change our skin colors to a degree. If I put you in an environment where you did nothing but sit on a sofa and binge on Netflix and eat potato chips, your body would change, your muscles would shrink, and your bones would get thinner, and so on. So the way you behave affects the form of your body. Lamarck's second idea was that changes like this that happen over one lifetime can be inherited. So if I made you all lift heavy loads all of your life, not only would your muscles get thicker and your bones get thicker, your offspring would be born with bigger muscles and thicker bones than they would have otherwise had. If we have a bunch of little birds hopping around and having to navigate puddles, they will end up stretching their legs, and their babies will be born with longer legs than they would otherwise have had. And after enough generations of this, you go from something like a robin to something like a flamingo. Take this ability for organisms to mold themselves to their environments, couple it with what Lamarck thought was life's innate tendency to increase in perfection, and you get something like this. We start up here with, this says basically protozoa and jellyfish, infusoire, polype, et radial. Those give rise to vel, that means worms. Those give rise to insects and arachnids and crustaceans, and annelids, that's segmented worms, cirripede, that's barnacles, mollusc, that's clams and snails and squid. Those give rise to fish and reptiles, birds, monotreme, that's like duck-billed platypus, and then amphibious mammals and cetaceans, and mammifères unguiculés, that's mammals with fingernails like primates, and mammifères ongulés, that's mammals with hoofs, hoofed mammals there. And you can start with very simple critters up here at the top, and those will give rise to all of these new branches, getting progressively more complex and also progressively well adapted to the environments that they find themselves in. So he did this from top to bottom. We'd usually make diagrams like this now from bottom to top, but hopefully you get the idea. And this could explain everything, so thought Lamarck, from the earliest life forms, which were some kind of little living globs in the mud, whatever they were, all the way to the appearance of humanity, from the goo to the zoo to you, as somebody once said. Lamarck's peers thought he was way too speculative, way too far-fetched. Lamarck died blind, died in poverty. One of his colleagues, a French guy named Cuvier, wrote a eulogy for Lamarck, which remains one of the bitchiest pieces of scientific writing that anybody has ever written. along the lines of, he was such a great guy and he had such a grand intellect, too bad he was a complete fool. But spoken with the very perfect French wit and sarcasm. Um, so yeah, aside from sarcastic jokes like that, most people ignored Lamarck. He died too poor to afford a permanent burial plot, by the way. So he was buried and then dug up 5 years later, and nobody even knows where his remains are now. That tended to happen in those days. But his ideas didn't die, and they inspired Robert Grant. Grant was crazy about everything Lamarck had said. He thought it was the best idea he'd ever heard. Lamarck may also have inspired a fellow by the name of Erasmus Darwin, who was a physician and generally a thinker, a very influential philosopher in his time, who'd had some very similar ideas to Lamarck's. We're not entirely sure who influenced whom, but Erasmus Darwin had already suggested that all life formed one living filament, starting from some kind of microscopic little glob that gave rise to more and more diverse and complex life forms until we ended up with the great diversity that we see now. I won't read the whole quote. Erasmus Darwin can get kind of carried away, but he's writing, "Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament which the great first cause endued with animality? The great first cause is God, but not really a personal God, some sort of, abstract principle that governs the universe. And somehow that created some first living thing, that living filament, that possessed the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity. That's Lamarck. And delivering down those improvements by generation to its posterity. That's also Lamarck. The idea that living things don't just adapt in their lifetimes, they can pass their adaptations down to the next generation. World without end. So, grand idea. He'd probably have been taken a bit more seriously if he hadn't put his ideas forth in the form of epic poems. Scientists tend not to do this so much now. He was considered a great poet in his time, but most people don't think it's held up very well. There's a reason why you probably never read any of his stuff back in high school English lit. So as he writes, organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass, that means a lens, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing. I definitely won't read all of this, but he also might have been taken more seriously if he hadn't been very, very, very enthusiastic about sex. When his first wife died, he took to, let's just say, free love. He had himself an awful lot of girlfriends. Very enthusiastic about the sex bit. And he wrote an entire poem explaining plant sexuality in terms of softcore porn. Every flower, of course, has female parts and male parts. Well, if it's a perfect flower, it does, right? You've got the ovary with the pistil in the center, and then surrounding it, you've got the anthers, right, with the male parts, the little pollen producing antheridia and all that. I assume you've heard of flowers. And he wrote this long poem explaining all this, but turning the female parts of each flower into a symbolic woman and the male parts of each flower into symbolic men. So there's one flower that has, one pistil, one female part, the pistil with the stigma on top, and 5 anthers and stamens, right? 5 male parts. And he turns this into this description of one, presumably woman, rolling around on silken perfume sheets, that's the petals of the flower, satisfying 5 men. Not written with any dirty words or anything like that. This is not, actual porn, but dang. Yeah, it tends to be one of the reasons why he doesn't always get taken seriously these days. As he wrote, all forms of life that shall this fond pair delight, and sex to sex the willing world unite. Hence on green leaves the sexual pleasures dwell, and loves and beauties crowd the blossom's bell. The wakeful anther in his silken bed o'er the pleased stigma bows his waxen head. Yeah, this is like botanical WAP we're talking. I've made him sound like a buffoon, but he was actually a respected doctor. You may or may not know this, but King George III, right, the British king when the colonies broke free, the guy who sings, "Oceans rise, empires fall, we have seen each other through it all," that guy. In his later years, King George III suffered from periodic outbreaks of mental illness. King George III, to use the clinical term, was nuttier than squirrel turds. And they had to send him to a palace in the south of London where he could basically run around and not disturb anybody. I've actually been there. It's now this great botanical gardens called Kew Gardens in London. Well worth a visit. And I think I've seen the actual tree. There was one particular tree that he used to get into shouting matches with because he thought it was the Emperor of Prussia. So yeah. Anyway, he also had lucid moments as well. It was these periodic attacks of it. Nobody's quite sure what it was. And I bring this up because Erasmus Darwin was actually asked to be King George III's personal physician. He was very well known. They figured if anybody could treat the king's illness, it would be Erasmus Darwin. But Erasmus turned down the job. But that's how well known he was. He was an inventor, and his friends, he was actually part of a society of scientific people that would meet in northern England under the full moon. And it included Joseph Priestley, the chemist, James Watt, who didn't invent but very much improved steam engines, and Benjamin Franklin, who would drop in when he was in town. You might think of Franklin as that weirdo who flew the kite in the thunderstorm. The truth is that Franklin was one of the most respected scientists in Europe at the time. If you've ever used a battery with a positive and a negative terminal, that's 3 concepts that Franklin invented: battery and the convention positive and negative for labeling battery terminals. Knew as much about electricity as any man alive, and very much welcome when he happened to be in Britain, which he got to do because he was a diplomat for the fledgling American Republic. So anyway, respected guy, and also Charles Darwin's grandfather. I didn't mention that part, but Erasmus Darwin was the father of Dr. Robert Darwin, who was the father of Charles Darwin. Young Darwin didn't really think much of Erasmus Darwin's work. You might think that this is where Charles Darwin got his wild ideas, but he wasn't really impressed. Darwin said is, he was taking a walk one day with Grant, who burst forth in high admiration of Lamarck and his views. I listened in silent astonishment, and as far as I can judge, without any effect on my mind. I had previously read the Zoonomia of my grandfather, but without producing any effect on me. So Darwin knew about Lamarck and his grandfather's work, but he wasn't impressed. I'm going to give you guys a break, but there's actually one more person I want you to meet. One more influence on Darwin that's worth mentioning at this time. Someone he met in the 2 years he was a medical student in Edinburgh, in Scotland. And that was a man named John Edmonston. John Edmonston had been a slave. He was from Africa. He'd been brought to South America, where Britain had a colony at the time. It's now the country of Suriname. And his owner had a sugar plantation. This is the actual plantation, by the way. So I guess Edmondstone would have looked like one of these slaves over here on the left. Britain still tolerated slavery in the colonies, certainly in the colonies that would become the United States. But even after that, they did not completely outlaw it in all of the empire until, I believe, 1834. So it was still going on in Suriname and in Jamaica and a couple of other places. But Great Britain had never allowed it on its own home territory. Uh, there had been some legal cases about it that had established the precedent. As people said, English air makes a man free. So if you brought a slave with you to England or Scotland, that slave was free the minute they stepped off the boat. So Edmonston had been freed and had set up as a taxidermist. We don't really know what he looked like. This is a modern picture, but this is supposed to be Edmonston in his workshop stuffing birds. And Darwin paid him for lessons in taxidermy. Darwin was keen on hunting. The first day of the season, he would be out there blasting away at birds. And like a lot of hunters, he wanted to keep some trophies. So he paid Edmonston to teach him taxidermy. That would really come in handy later. Darwin picked up a skill he would end up needing. But he also became friends with Edmonston. They spent hours talking. Edmonston described the South American tropical rainforest where he had lived. And Darwin decided he really wanted to visit South America someday. Years later, he remembered Edmonston as a very pleasant and intelligent man. And I'm going to come back to that. Edmonston would end up being more important in the development of Darwin's thinking than it may seem. I'm not bringing him up just to be, a token African. There's more going on here than meets the eye at first, and I'll come to that either at the end of today or tomorrow. Right now, I'm going to take a 10-minute break. So I am going to, let me see. I'm going to stop the recording right now.